Welcome to our brief introductory lecture on Gustavo Gutiérrez, the Theology of Gustavo Gutiérrez, the originator of the Theology of Liberation. This lecture will have preliminary remarks about Gutierrez and some biographical information, and also, since it's sort of a pivotal point, he's reflecting developments in the social sciences and in philosophy. I'm also going to give a very brief introduction to hermeneutics and critical theory, which will be informative not only for our reading of Gutierrez, but for our future consideration of black, feminist, womanist, and other varieties of theology. I recommend, by the way, this book. The Reader, this one has a different cover than the one that's in the picture there, is more current. Another excellent book to add to your collection. And when I lecture about Gutierrez, I'll be referring to readings from this book. These are all major publications of Gutierrez. In addition to these writings, he was very influential in the production of numerous church documents, Catholic Church official documents in Latin America that were very influential. Of course, a Theology of Liberation is the signal text, the seminal text, which was transformative, which is the reason we're studying Gutierrez, in addition to these other writings. Now, because Gutierrez's theology, which hit the world scene in the late 1960s and early 1970s, directly highlighted and still highlights massive economic global inequities, and challenged, and still challenges, predominant global economic interests, he has been the target of significant resistance, even attempts to categorize him straight away as a Marxist, and as a communist. He is neither. All of this in the middle, back in the 60s and 70s, all of this in the middle of what was a very hot global Cold War. As a result of these still intense and powerful global dynamics, now focused more upon criticism or praise of globalism, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Economic Forum, with its annual summits in Davos, Switzerland, it is important, given that these are still highly dynamic and powerful and criticized dynamics, it's important, if one is gathering information from online or other popular sources of news and opinion, to realize that one needs to be on guard against ideologically motivated attacks upon Gutierrez's character or theology. And a quick look I just took at some popular online sites revealed that these distortions remain in play. Now, that is not to say that either Gutierrez or his theology are beyond criticism. We would not say that about any theologian, even ourselves. But it is to urge extra caution when you are reading secondary sources, in particular online sources. In general, if you hit critiques of Gutierrez, be sure to consider the degree to which the person offering the critique does, or more to the point, does not take class, that is economic class, into account in their own work. And let me be sure to specify that many who are indeed concerned over economic inequities still see capitalism as our best or only practical option, and so they affirm capitalism while seeking to instantiate forms of governance which mitigate against the massive inequities in wealth and power that unrestrained capitalism appears to generate. One example of this would be Pope Francis's Laudato Si, which attends to structural issues of participation in both national and transnational regimes of governance, seeking more inclusive and diverse participation in policymaking bodies, as a path towards reform or containment, not the overthrow, but the reform or containment for productive ends in terms of what's most loving and just, a reform of contemporary global economic and political relations. So it's a reformist document in the spirit of liberation theology, but it's one which is trying to work with global capitalist dynamic and dominant economic structures, not advocating for their overthrow. Now, while Pope Francis certainly never identified as a liberation theologian, his decision to honor St. Francis of Assisi and take on the name Pope Francis, his decision to honor St. Francis of Assisi, who is celebrated for abandoning a life of privilege and dedicating himself to a ministry for the poor and marginalized, including other creatures. The examples Francis has set as Pope and his teachings, again, see especially Laudato Si, are all consistent with the emphases of Gutierrez. In the 20th and early 21st century, the Catholic hierarchy's reception of liberation theology was unfriendly, to put it mildly. But upon Gutierrez's 90th birthday, just a few years ago, Pope Francis sent him a card of celebration. Note that with the globally influential theology of liberation and the papacy of St. Francis, the global church has now found significant inspiration and globally impactful formative influence from a theological trajectory indigenous to Latin America, at least indigenous to Latin America of the past couple of centuries. Of course, Latin America indigenously was other people, not Christian, but now it is that this is a Christianity which has become indigenous, in a sense, to Latin America. Those are controversial terms. I won't get into that any further. Let me just we'll highlight that as an issue. In the study of this current series of lectures, which I'm doing on Christianity and Christian theology, which is certainly far from exclusive, we're bypassing Barth, Bonhoeffer, Tillich, Reinhold and H. Richard Niebuhr, among many others, but we now move, speaking roughly, from London with Wesley to Berlin with Schleiermacher to Lima, Peru with Gutierrez. We will soon be moving into the U.S. context, where black, feminist, womanist, and queer theologies are all largely originated, though all have significant international dimensions and versions. Gutierrez's Theology of Liberation also significantly influenced other theological movements focused upon economic and colonial dynamics, such as the Theology of Struggle in the Philippines, or Minjung, or People's Theology in Korea, among others. Though they are Catholic and Protestant, the extraordinary similarity of Gutierrez's thought to that of John Wesley will become evident. Both gain access to privileged education and status through their clerical connections. Both choose to remain within and to identify with impoverished communities. Both emphasize that faith without works is dead, and both stress the importance of performing works of mercy for both individual Christians and the churches they represent. They stress the churches to be engaged in works of mercy. Perhaps the main difference between them lies in Gutierrez's access to and understanding of the systemic critiques of the social sciences developed in the late 19th and 20th centuries. These are conceptual tools not yet available to Wesley in the 18th century. While for some modern Northern readers, this is a sort of source of criticism, not affirmation, like Wesley, Gutierrez is a constant and close reader of the Christian scriptures. In a fashion similar to Schleiermacher, Gutierrez inhabits an overwhelmingly Christian world. And while he comes to be educated not only in theology, but also in cutting-edge secular philosophy and psychology in leading European schools, and while he explicitly recognizes the secular challenge to Christian understanding, his conceptual frame of reference remains his overwhelmingly Christian Peruvian context. I should add that he does at some points attend significantly to indigenous peoples in Peru, but this is on the whole marginal to the ways in which he's been influential. Moreover, as with Wesley, for Gutierrez, an emphasis upon a faith profoundly attentive to need and injustice in our world is not in tension with concrete hope in a literal heaven. Note that this runs contrary to a common and clearly mistaken trope among progressive North American and European theologians, a trope which buys into Marx's idea that Christian belief in heaven must function as an opiate, rendering people placid in the face of social injustice. It turns out that not just in the cases of Wesley and Gutierrez, but in oppressed communities around the world, people who are actually experiencing massive injustice do just fine hoping in heaven while still retaining all the motivation they need to engage in active, this-worldly struggle against oppression. By comparison to similarities in their understanding of this-worldly social justice implications of the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, and of what that means about the character of the faith of those who would follow Jesus Christ, in comparison to their similarities on those issues, the differences between Wesley's Protestantism and Gutierrez's Catholicism pales. Indeed, there is little doubt that Gutierrez would be among those whom Wesley would affirm as one of those who loves alike. And while to my knowledge, Wesley was not a source of Gutierrez's thought, for contextual reasons this is hardly surprising, I expect he would warmly reciprocate Wesley's affirmation. Let me now move beyond these preliminary observations and turn to a brief biography of Gutierrez's life. Gustavo Gutiérrez was born into an impoverished but loving family in Lima, Peru on June 8, 1928. From the ages of 12 to 18, he was bedridden with osteomyelitis, a painful physical disease. According to Nikoloff, during this period he became an avid reader and a cultivator of close friendships. I think we might also imagine, and here we should pause and reflect with regard to our own childhoods, or perhaps those of our own children, what it would be like to spend one's middle and high school years in pain and bedridden. We might also imagine that, as is so often the case among those who suffer, Gutierrez cultivated sensitivity to the physical, psychological, and spiritual suffering of others. He was a brilliant student and entered the University of San Marcos in Lima as a medical student, intending to study psychiatry, but after 3 years of study, he decided to enter the priesthood. After completing his studies in Lima, from 1951 to 1959, he studied philosophy, psychology, and theology at elite European schools, the Catholic University of Louvain, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, in Belgium, the University of Lyon in France, and the Gregorian University in Rome. From these schools, he earned master's degrees in philosophy and theology before returning to Peru, where he would spend much of his life living and working in impoverished areas of Lima. He received a doctorate from the University of Lyon in 1985, but by that point he was receiving the degree not after completing a program in doctoral studies, but based upon the profound global influence of his work in theology. As a young priest in his 30s, Gutierrez participated in the fourth session of Vatican II in the early 1960s in Rome as a theological assistant to Bishop Manuel Larraín of Chile. In noting the disparity between the optimism that pervades Vatican II in contrast to the reality he knew in Latin America, Gutierrez decided that what he was witnessing on a global scale was something that he would later call an eruption of the poor in history. This movement is described by Latin American social sciences as the Movimiento Popular. This sort of movement is known as popularism in English. It marks widespread and socially significant class-based protest and is typically met with fierce denunciation from mainstream institutions in society. This certainly defined mainstream political and church response to Gutierrez's liberation theology, both in Latin America and in North America and in Europe. In any case, what is decisively new here, to say again, is the social sciences' structural analysis of the issues. More on this presently. Soon after Vatican II, back in his Latin American context, Gutierrez played a pivotal role in producing the documents at the Second General Conference of the Latin American Episcopacy in Medellin, Colombia, in 1968. Significantly, this is where he first introduces language describing an option for the poor. Gutierrez's pastoral option at this point for the poor, which evolved into his better-known preferential option for the poor, which was actually the next, 10 years later, the Third General Conference of the Latin American Episcopacy that was held in Puebla, Latin America. So the pastoral option for the poor at the Second General Conference evolved into the preferential option for the poor at the Third General Conference, and this was his progression, which is already visible in his Theology of Liberation text. This phrase, preferential option for the poor, has been pilloried for claiming divine favoritism and is so controversial that we'll go ahead and explain that, as we will see, for Gutierrez, this is meant to be interpreted in a way akin to triage decisions in medicine. That is, in an emergency context, one gives preferential treatment to those with the worst injuries. For instance, you treat the person who cannot breathe or with heart failure before the person who has a broken leg. This is not unequal valuation or treatment of different individuals, but equal valuation and treatment of different individuals when measured in relation to their unequal need. Back real quick. So that's the sense in which it's a preferential option for the poor when you have a constant God of love, loving everyone equally in a world in which people are not suffering equally. That's where there's a preferential option for the poor in that triage sense. In 1968, shortly before the Medellin Conference, Gutierrez proposes a theology of liberation. This is the first use of the term liberation in this way, and as we will see, Gutierrez fleshes out a multi-layered theological understanding of liberation. In coming years, we will hear of black liberation, feminist liberation, animal liberation, and of liberation philosophy. While liberation in all these contexts shares a family resemblance, it is important to understand its meaning in relation to the various particular discourses and contexts in which it is being used. It is important to realize that in his context, Gutierrez was using liberation in deliberate contrast to the reigning term of development, which was especially important with regard to international and economic policies. Development here was understood in the sense of a contrast between the developed and the developing, or the first and the third worlds. So it implicitly invoked a hierarchy and made one pattern of socioeconomic organization normative. Development in this rhetorical context tended to be measured strictly in terms of economic productivity, and was even more problematic when understood in relation to cultural identity, as is visible in what was the commonplace distinction between the developed and undeveloped world. Liberation, as we will see, does have an economic component for Gutierrez, but he also has a personal, that is in relation to capacity for autonomy, political, cultural, and spiritual levels of meaning with regard to liberation theology. In other words, he is going to comment upon the contrast between the developed and undeveloped world plays poorly and in a detrimental way on the self-understanding and evaluation and self-consciousness of those who are labeled as being part of an undeveloped or still developing world. In a similar way, in the late 1990s, Larry Rasmussen in Earth Community and Earth Ethics would contrast sustainable development with sustainable community. The development of sustainable development was typically defined so economic factors were privileged, while the community of the sustainable community ensured that peoples, other creatures, and the land itself were also figured into the assessments. As Gutierrez realized, these subtle shifts in terminology could have major consequences not only for how people saw the world, but for real-world distribution of wealth and power. Now, while it is his work with the Catholic hierarchy and his books which make him so influential as a theologian, we should take care to note that until later in his life, Gutierrez's full-time job was as a priest of a local parish in Lima, and that until he reached the later phases of his life, now in his 90s, he's still not officially retired. Even now he's associated with the University of Notre Dame, but until those later phases of his life, he preached weekly, which is why he would refer to himself as a part-time theologian. Still, the reason we are studying Gutierrez is because in 1971, developing ideas already visible in the documents he helped to write at Medellin and elsewhere, he publishes what will prove to be a seminal text, Theologia de la Liberation Perspectives, which quickly becomes nationally and internationally influential. Now, while I will not pursue this issue here, I should note that in terms of numbers of people actively engaged, the emerging church in Latin America has been not so much dominated by liberation theology as it is by Pentecostalism. I'm just going to make that note and move on. In the introduction to his Gutierrez reader, Nikolov summarizes well the essence of Gutierrez's theology of liberation. In a widely accepted and frequently quoted schema, Gutierrez proposes that liberation be understood as a threefold process which embraces 1, the creation of a just and humane socioeconomic and political order, 2, the emancipation of human consciousness from self-concern, in the case of those who abuse others for their own self-aggrandizement, or the emancipation of human consciousness from the lack of a sense of self, in the case of those crushed in history by the selfishness of others, 2, in both cases, 2, solidarity with others. And 3, redemption by God from sin for a communion of love. In a second lecture on Gutierrez and his main theological themes, I will turn to highlight his ideas in dialogue with various readings from the Nikolov collection of writings. Before that, however, I need to digress in order to clarify what is meant by systemic critique or systemic distortion, or what you might also hear discussed in terms of critical theory or critical social theory. And I need to explain these new tools of the modern social sciences and philosophy, and I'll do that in relation to a few current examples. This understanding will be vital not only for understanding Gutierrez, but also for understanding Black, feminist, womanist, queer, and other recent developments in theology. Now, first, consider the noted sociologist C. Wright Mill's famous contrast between troubles and issues in his The Sociological Imagination. Troubles run along the lines of a Louis L'Amour or Clint Eastwood Western. There's a bad guy who's taken over a town, injustice reigns, the town's got troubles. Along comes our hero, quick with a gun, takes down the bad guy, no more troubles. But what if injustice reigns not because of troubles, but because of what Mills designated issues? Let me illustrate this in conversation with some contemporary examples. First, consider the devastating global financial crisis of 2008. Consider Bernie Madoff, a celebrated Wall Street financier who, it became evident amidst the crisis, was running a massive Ponzi scheme which ended up costing a multitude of people their life savings. Madoff became a potent symbol of the financial crisis, and much publicity surrounded his trial and sentencing. But this involves seeing the financial crisis as a product of troubles, the work of Bernie Madoff and other individual bad actors. But people focused upon issues in contrast to troubles would say that Madoff's scheme, as big and devastating as it was, represented only a small part of the financial collapse, And at the heart of the collapse were actors who were doing nothing illegally, but playing legally, which is not to say necessarily ethically, but legally, playing legally within within an industry where, speaking roughly, there appears to have been capture of regulatory bodies and legally codified cost-benefit dynamics, which rewarded the taking or distributing of risks in ways that generated spectacular financial returns while fostering imbalance such that the rewards of those investments were disproportionately apportioned to those with wealth and power, while the risks of those same investments were disproportionately apportioned to those with little wealth and power. Insofar as pivotal problems such as these, structural issues in how the market was governed and ruled, insofar as pivotal problems such as these lay at the heart of the financial crisis, and resulted not from bad actors, such as Madoff, but from structural problems involving the crafting of laws and the access, independence, and teeth of regulatory bodies, then ensuring a just accounting of responsibility and a prevention of a repeat of the crisis would necessarily involve a rewriting of the laws addressing those structural issues. Now, this is not an either-or, but a vital both-and. Madoff is a trouble, and the bad actors of this world must be guarded against. But insofar as the roots of the financial crisis were not contained to the wrongdoing, the illegal acts of people like Madoff and others, but were related to the actions of others who were acting in accord with dominant and legal practices, it is a devastating mistake to think only in terms of troubles, that is, in terms of bad players, for reforming the issues, the structures that fostered the crisis, is also critical, so that moving forward, there would be adequate regulation and oversight and just incentivizing of the financial industry. Focusing upon that, on the issues such as that, is, in addition to the troubles, is also essential if one's going to address the problems. And notably, in this, for instance, it's far from clear that those reforms have been adequately taken. Again, both and thinking is vital. That is, one must think in terms of both troubles, bad actors, and in terms of issues, bad structures. If in response to a devastating event like the financial crisis, one responds only in terms of troubles, the actors, when the issues are often definitively in play, then one's response will be inadequate to address the problem. All right, to unpack these ideas of systemic distortions or structural critique and critical theory vis-a-vis another example, this one more tightly tied to the international dynamics that largely concern Gutierrez, let us consider the issue in relation to COVID-19 vaccines. Now, according to an article in the March 3rd, 2021 edition of The Intercept, numerous countries around the world, including Colombia and Chile, are attempting to ramp up production of COVID-19 vaccine without express permission from pharmaceutical companies. This in a context where wealthy countries, with around 16% of the world's population, have secured more than half of all COVID-19 vaccine contracts. In the past, when countries such as these have compelled production of expensive cancer or AIDS or hepatitis B drugs that are otherwise prohibitively expensive for sick people in their countries, the pharmaceutical industry has successfully petitioned the U.S. government to punish those countries economically. All this, of course, according to this article. While the question of whether or not the incredible profits garnered by pharmaceutical companies for drugs is ethical generally, while that question is certainly an open question, at least in most of those cases, we are dealing with companies who risked private funds developing drugs because in return they were going to retain exclusive rights to price and market those drugs. In the case of COVID-19 vaccines, however, the funding was largely public. So the Pfizer vaccine was developed with $450 million from the German government, The Moderna vaccine was developed with around $1 billion from the U.S. government, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, Johnson & Johnson received about $1.5 billion from the U.S. government for its COVID-19 vaccine development program. So the article is arguing the normal argument against controlling the prices and making these drugs accessible globally doesn't hold because so many public monies were involved. The article argues pharmaceutical companies have benefited from massive public funding. Moreover, massive sacrifices have been made and continue to be made by billions of people to restrict the spread of COVID in the hope that the vaccines can be secured and the virus contained. And this sacrifice includes hundreds of millions of young people whose susceptibility to the virus is statistically extraordinarily small. In other words, there's been an inequitable generational sacrifice that has not been sufficiently acknowledged. Moreover, there is a massive global need. So it is not clear, even on ordinary capitalist grounds, that there is any good reason to extend normal international patent protections to COVID-19 vaccines. Moreover, with regard to Gutierrez and capitalism in this issue, the Catholic Church has long affirmed the responsibility of governments to provide universal basic health care. So many of the practices of the for-profit medical industry would already, aside from the COVID-19 instance, we have such massive public funding and such an unprecedented global emergency, even many of the ordinary practices of the for-profit medical industry would be outside the bounds of what the Catholic Church considers to be ethical. Vis-a-vis COVID, especially in light of the way profit, power, and access is indexed to structural inequalities between rich and poor nations, many of the inequalities of which are rooted in histories of colonialism and imperialism, Gutierrez would condemn any profiteering and insist on structural adjustments that would correct for historical injustices and ensure equal access to COVID-19 vaccines. Such a liberation position was expressed in February of 2021 by the South African Archbishop Thabo Siso Makgoba when he urged, as reported in this other Intercept article, patent waivers be extended in this spirit. According to a report in The Guardian on March 5th, the World Health Organization agrees that there should be these patent waivers with regard to the COVID-19 vaccines. Here, Gutierrez and Wesley would concur. The gospel call to love our neighbors would dictate that the Christian prophetic voice should advocate for the prioritizing of the health of the impoverished and vulnerable, and Gutierrez would stress the need to consider and redress structural factors which have contributed to the extreme disparities of wealth that afflict our global civilization. Now, these structural factors may not be the only factors. Remember, the both and thinking, or maybe there's not just two, but myriad variables that should be in play. So we're not limited to this, but these factors, he would say, definitely should be brought into play in the conversation while we determine what should be done. At the time of this lecture, the path the Biden administration will follow vis-a-vis health waivers remains uncertain. Another example, the U.S. House has just passed a police reform bill, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. According to a March 3rd, 2021 article in Politico, and the White, I'm quoting from the article, the bill would prohibit racial and religious profiling by law enforcement at every level, while banning chokeholds at the federal level and no-knock warrants in federal drug cases. The federal policies would be tied to law enforcement funding for governments at the state and local levels. The measure would also eliminate qualified immunity for law enforcement and mandate data collection on police encounters and create a nationwide police misconduct registry to hold accountable problematic officers who are fired or leave an agency. So note how the presenting cases described that the legislation addresses all involve bad actors, that is, troubles. And so entirely reasonable. Note how the remedies are also largely, not wholly, but largely focused upon identifying and acting against bad actors, those who are overtly racist or acting in racist ways. Now, contrast this to the structural analysis and proposals of Michelle Alexander's carefully argued and thoroughly documented The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. I highly recommend this book. The Age of Colorblindness is not primarily concerned with individuals who say they do not see color. It is about how laws and policies, which are in no way explicitly indexed to race, nonetheless have a disproportionate impact that turns out to be highly correlative to race, resulting in de facto racist consequences, which imitate the old Jim Crow laws, which were overtly racist. I'll give you some quotes from the book to give you a sense of the argument that she is making. President Ronald Reagan officially announced the current drug war in 1982, before crack became an issue in the media or a crisis in poor black neighborhoods. A few years after the drug war was declared, crack began to spread rapidly in the poor black neighborhoods of Los Angeles and later emerged in cities across the country. The Reagan administration hired staff to publicize the emergence of crack cocaine in 1985 as part of a strategic effort to build public and legislative support for the war. The media campaign was an extraordinary success. Now, her point here is the war on drugs is not about overtly race, even though the way it's going to play out is going to have de facto racist consequences that lead to what she's calling the new Jim Crow. Almost overnight, the media was saturated with images of black crack whores or crack dealers and crack babies, images that seem to confirm the worst negative racial stereotypes about impoverished inner city residents. The media bonanza surrounding the new demon drug helped to catapult the war on drugs from an ambitious federal policy to an actual war. The impact of the drug war, Michelle Alexander goes on, has been astounding. In less than 30 years, the U.S. penal population exploded from around 300,000 to more than 2 million, with drug convictions accounting for the majority of the increase. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing the rates of nearly every developed country, even surpassing those in highly repressive regimes like Russia, China, and Iran. In Germany, 93 people are in prison for every 100,000 adults and children. In the United States, the rate is roughly 8 times that, or 750 per 100,000. The racial dimension of mass incarceration is its most striking feature. Now remember, the war on drugs is not about race directly. It's going to have this racial consequence. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities. The United States imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. In Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, it is estimated that 3 out of every 4 young black men, and nearly all those in the poorest neighborhoods, can expect to serve time in prison. Similar rates of incarceration can be found in black communities across America. These stark racial disparities cannot be explained by the rates of drug crime. Studies show that people of all colors use and sell illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates. If there are significant differences in the surveys to be found, they frequently suggest that whites, particularly white youth, are more likely to engage in drug crime than people of color. That is not what one would guess, however, when entering our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown people convicted of drug crimes. In some states, Alexander goes on, black men have been admitted to prison on drug charges at rates 20 to 50 times greater than those of white men. And in the major cities racked by the drug war, as many as 80% of young African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These young men are part of a growing undercast, permanently locked up and locked out of mainstream society. Between 1960 and 1990, for example, official crime rates in Finland, Germany, and the United States were close to identical. Yet the U.S. incarceration rate quadrupled. The Finnish rate fell by 60%, and the German rate was stable in that period. Despite similar crime rates, each government chose to impose different levels of punishment. The term mass incarceration refers not only to the criminal justice system, but also to the larger web of laws, rules, policies, and customs that control those labeled criminals both in and out of prison. Once released from prison, and this for me was one of the most stunningly informative parts of the book. Alexander documents, by the way, all of this in minute detail in the course of the book. Once released from prison, people enter a hidden underworld of legalized discrimination and permanent social exclusion. They are members of America's new undercast. Most people imagine that the explosion in the U.S. prison population during the last 25 years reflects changes in crime rates. Few would guess that our prison population leaped from approximately 350,000 to 2.3 million in such a short period of time due to changes in laws and policies, not changes in crime rates. I mean, to kind of put this in a folksy way, this means in the happy days, the good old days supposedly, right, we had the same crime rate, but not nearly the same rate of incarceration. Yet it has been changes in our laws, particularly the dramatic increase in the length of prison sentences, that has been responsible for the growth of our prison system, not increases in crime. According to a report released by the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Statistics in 2006, the United States spent a record $185 billion for police protection, detention, judicial, and legal activities in 2003. Adjusting for inflation, these figures reflect a tripling of justice expenditures since 1982. The justice system, Alexander continues, employed almost 2.4 million people in 2003, 58% of them at the local level and 31% at the state level. If 4 out of 5 people were released from prisons, in other words, if we went back to the incarceration rate we had earlier, when we had the exact same crime rate, far more than 1 million people could lose their jobs. There is also the private sector investment to consider. Prisons are big business and have become deeply entrenched in America's economic and political system. Even beyond private prison companies, a whole range of prison profiteers must be reckoned with if mass incarceration is to be undone, including phone companies that gouge families with loved ones behind bars by charging them exorbitant rates to communicate with their loved ones, gun manufacturers that sell tasers, guns, rifles, and pistols to prison guards and police, private health care providers contracted by the state to provide, typically abysmal health care to people in prison, the U.S. military, which relies on prison labor to provide military gear to soldiers in Iraq, corporations that use prison labor to avoid paying decent wages, and the politicians, lawyers, and bankers who structure deals to build new prisons, often in predominantly white rural communities. Deals that often promise far more to local communities than they deliver, she says. In other words, there is now a massive industry, massive interest built up in this high rate of incarceration. All of these, it's just, again, structural issues. All of these corporate and political interests have a stake in the expansion, not the elimination, of the system of mass incarceration. Consider also the lengthy to-do list for reformers. If we become serious about dismantling the system of mass incarceration, we must end the war on drugs. So the pressing question is mass incarceration and what has, largely as a result of Alexander's book, come to be known as the school-to-prison pipeline that permanently derails a remarkable percentage of American blacks. American black youth in particular, who, remember, do not statistically use drugs at a higher rate than white youths. So if these devastating racist realities are not the product of the actions of racist individuals, but a product of the war on drugs and associated policies, vigorously supported, Alexander notes, by Joe Biden and expanded under Barack Obama. She's writing this, of course, before Biden's president, so they were vigorously supported by then Senator Joe Biden, and expanded under President Barack Obama. Then insofar as these structural factors, again, legal definitions of drug crime, formulas for sentencing, federal incentive packages for police related to the war on drugs, insofar as these structural factors, that is, insofar as issues, not racist individuals, are the real source of the injustice, and these are structural factors which are not indexed directly to race, but which have, it turns out, been devastating in the way they actually perpetuate the old effects of the old Jim Crow laws. If these are the real source, or a real source of the injustice, a major source of the injustice, then we have to ask if the proposals of the Police Reform Act, which appear to be aimed largely at eliminating the behavior or racist individuals or groups, we have to ask if the proposals of the act adequately address the structural issues Alexander's data-driven analysis reveal. And I've only been able to hint. This is a big book, and it's heavily documented with studies to support the conclusions. So remember, we are. Let me finish that prior sentence. So insofar as the George Floyd Act, right, focuses on an individual, and in particular can be focused on what looks to be what would be allegedly the racist action of a police officer, and looks to address those sorts of issues, right? Then without also looking at the issues, without considering the issues, the structural issues that Alexander has uncovered, then you could have a solution which doesn't actually address a major source of the problem. Now remember, we're stressing both and thinking. And in this case, we're dealing with politics, where compromise is virtually always necessary. So when we look at the George Floyd Act or other laws, we should take care before judging political figures from too idealistic perspective. And so the George Floyd Act would indeed, it looks like, in part address the problem of racist individuals, and that is an admirable and important goal. But Alexander is describing policing practices that are having a devastating effect upon the black community that in no way turns upon racism or the lack thereof of individual police officers. The source of the problem is elsewhere. And actually many of these police officers themselves are black and are caught within systemic distortions whose effect furthers systemic racism. So Alexander unveils the structural racism embedded in policies which are not intrinsically racist, but which de facto perpetuate Jim Crow dynamics, racist dynamics, and which would continue to do the same de facto racist damage, even if there were no racism in law enforcement. This is why it is vital to engage in systemic or structural analysis and to insist upon reform of systemic structural distortions, or else all the reformist passion and energy in policy may fail to redress major dimensions of policies which are de facto racist. Okay, so that was all, I think, very complicated, but I hope it gave you a sense of the importance of the both and thinking, and in particular the importance of functioning on complex structural dynamics which lead to circumstances which can be rectified only with equally complex structural reform. All right. Such attention to systemic distortions is, again, what distinguishes Gutierrez and Pope Francis from Wesley, who did not have the conceptual tools of critical theory at hand. So he tended to focus just on issues. Insofar as thinking in terms of systems is difficult and non-intuitive for most all of us, it is also what distinguishes Gutierrez, Pope Francis, and Michel Alexander's forms of analysis from our ordinary ways of thinking about and addressing injustice. Though we hear a lot in the public sphere about structural racism, structural sexism, and even, though to a lesser degree, structural classism, which is the dimension at both national and international levels that Gutierrez is focused upon, it is not obvious that everyone is fully aware of what it means to analyze and address problems from a systemic perspective. And that leaves us all the more vulnerable to systemic distortions over which reforms focused upon individuals have almost no hope of overcoming. All right. So I used the sociologist C. Wright Mills and his distinction between troubles and issues because it's relatively easy to follow. As complicated as that all was, and as inadequate as I feel like my explanation maybe was, but I hope I gave it some sense of this. But let me note that the same emphasis upon systemic or structural issues is also, and arguably primarily, a function of the critical theory that largely burst upon the scene as a result of Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment, which in relation to philosophy and the very influential Frankfurt School, think Jürgen Habermas, is rightly credited as the foundationalist text and tradition of critical theory. Don't worry about that if you don't know what I just said, but I do want to make sure I nodded towards some significant figures and schools of thought in this area. So let me close with some preliminary remarks upon hermeneutics and theology, and also upon theology and intersectionality. Before beginning, however, let me remind us all that Schleiermacher is the so-called father of hermeneutics because he is one of the first major theorists to emphasize the importance of the relation between context and understanding, an emphasis that would eventually dethrone what modern Western reasons idealizing of objective, universal, acontextual understanding. Schleiermacher's insights would eventually dethrone modern Western reason's idealizing of objective, universal, acontextual understanding. It's often called the quest for certainty. Now, hermeneutics is a fancy word for the study of the understanding of understanding. It is not, contrary to a common confusion, equivalent to exegesis or interpretation. Consider even so simple a word as father. When I say father, I provoke as many different meanings of father into understanding as there are people listening. Perhaps you are a father, or perhaps now, after the tragic death, are a father in a different sense. Perhaps you could never be a father because of your sex, or perhaps people expect you to be a father, but you do not want to be. Perhaps you were abused by your father, or are a father who abuses. Perhaps your life was transformed by the work of a priest, or you rely on the confessional. And so when I say father, you think of a priest. Perhaps you never knew your father, or do not know who your father is. Perhaps you are wondering why I did not say mother, and are running through analogous possibilities for mother. Perhaps you do not fit into the mother-father binary, and while you have nothing against mothers and fathers, you cannot help but feeling alienated when Mother's and Father's Day comes around. This is to name only some of a long list of significant possibilities, and of how father could be nuanced for different. Is all of us hear it in different ways according to who we are, how we're placed, and even in small gatherings, it is not too much to think that the simple word father, even so simple and seemingly obvious a word as father, conjures up diverse and powerful reactions and meanings. Now, this applies to all sorts of words. In fact, pretty much all words. Father, mother, girl, boy, man, woman, trans, straight, queer, black, white, American, Chinese, Indian, immigrant, indigenous, Jewish, Buddhist, rich, poor, and on and on. We are all raised up from infancy and literally come to awareness first from within a family and community with one set of understandings or another, and most everyone you grew up with may have identified and treated you in accord with a certain way of understanding these categories, which themselves are part of powerful histories and customs into which we are all born, and in accord with which we all understand ourselves. And while some of these traditional ways of understanding may be productive and affirming, others may be demeaning and hurtful to you or others. We all, from infancy, come to consciousness, are thrown into existence in one specific context or another, and are raised understanding ourselves predominantly in accord with one way of understanding or another, a way of understanding which literally determines how we first see, feel, and understand our world and our place in it. That is why it's important for me to explicitly name for you and for myself my identity as a self-identified cisgendered straight white male, among other things, because that means that I have grown up and lived with an identity that has been largely predominant and affirmed in my context. And because of that general affirmation, it is not natural for me to understand what it is to think, understand, and live in a world from the perspectives of those with different identities. Moreover, since my identity in most all ways aligns with predominant cultural power structures and narratives, it will have been easier for me to move through life without having to be concerned with the ways others, who are in various ways marginalized, have understood the world. That is, insofar as in the United States during my life it has been a man's world, or a white man's world, or a cisgendered white man's world, my life pretty much has gone in tune with the world. Of course, there will be hardships and challenges and perhaps real misfortune, no matter who you are, but I will not have had the world hit me with turns of phrase, everyday reactions, with imagery in music, films, and literature, with jokes, and even outright hostility that continually says to me that I just do not fit in, or that I am in some vague but devastating sense somehow wrong in the world. And of course, insofar as over the course of my life things evolve such that it is no longer a cisgendered white man's world, I myself am quite likely to feel surprised, confused, unsettled, somehow wrong in the world. Now, because my identity tends to fit naturally within cultural norms, those whose identities do not conform to the predominant cultural models have an epistemological advantage over me. For I have to work to notice differences that hit them over the head. People with marginalized identities will necessarily have some understanding of what is culturally normative, for that is essential to their daily survival. And of course, they will also have an understanding of how reality looks from their marginalized perspective, for that is who they are. In this sense, those whose identity conforms to the norm will quite naturally tend toward a monolithic vision. So they must make some effort and be open to trying to learn how to see the world through others' eyes. Those who must negotiate mainstream culture, even as they also embody a marginal identity, will, by contrast, quite naturally have at least stereoscopic vision. Because they've got to see both from the mainstream perspective and they also will see from their own marginalized perspective. Though inevitably they too will need to work to understand diverse other perspectives. For example, in the English 1990s movie The Full Monty, one of the characters asked what it is like to be employed for an extended period of time, replies that it is exhausting. His tone and context make it clear that he is not talking about straightforward physical exhaustion, but personal, existential, spiritual exhaustion. If you have never been employed, this response may surprise you, and your sense for its meaning will remain at second hand. If you have been unemployed for an extended period of time, then there is a good chance you will think that this is the perfect term and find its meaning resonant. Similarly, if you have never been unemployed, you will most likely not think twice about asking when you first meet someone, "What do you do?" If you have been unemployed, or your work is in an area which is culturally marginalized, let's say stay-at-home mom or dad, you will instantly feel the existential dagger hidden in this seemingly innocent and perfectly common question. For Gutierrez, who grew up and long ministered in impoverished communities, these same principles apply vis-a-vis poverty. Since the Jewish scriptures, in particular the Hebrew Exodus and exilic writings and the New Testament context of Jesus and Paul, if not Saul, but Paul, speak on the whole from contexts of poverty and the marginalization, Gutierrez thinks those who are similarly impoverished may be especially well situated to discern depths of meaning in these writings. Now, applying this train of thought, strictly speaking, there are as many identities as there are people in existence, right? So you can take that father thing, expand it to all of this. For everyone has a uniquely blended identity. But when we speak of discrimination or prejudice today in the West, we have in mind a few major markers of identity that have been the source of considerable pain and discrimination. Among many others, there are racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, ageism, speciesism, and classism, which is Gutierrez focuses. Note in this regard that there is the personal epistemological issue, the facticity of every human's understanding, the fact that we each come to understand and see the world from the distinct perspective of our uniquely blended context and heritage and upraising and identities. That's one aspect. And two is there is the social, cultural, and political sedimentation norming of dominant forms of identity. So in the United States, in the early 21st century, white, cisgendered, male, able, moneyed, and such would be the normative. Such that those whose identities happen to align with predominant norms and interests may not even notice these realities, even as in myriad subtle and significant ways they are privileged by them. Critical theory presumes the truth of both points. I don't know why that says their first point. Critical theory it takes both of these points into consideration, and it works to unmask structural systemic distortions which illicitly and unjustifiably, now this is vis-a-vis this unjustifiably, this is complicated, right? So suffice it to say here that being marginalized for one's passionate Nazism or pedophilia or the like is generally considered justified marginalization. So not looking to legitimize anything at all, right? So still having some ethical basis, and this is again where it gets complicated. Critical theory works to unmask structural systemic distortions which illicitly privilege certain identities and delegitimize others. So, given this understanding of the insights bequeathed by hermeneutics and critical theory, which I hope now you can see the overlap where hermeneutics and critical theory lead to the perception of how structures and systems are playing a role in versions of injustice and oppression that should be addressed. It should be clear that intersectionality should mean, and in pop culture this term is sometimes misappropriated, but it should mean keeping track of the way in which various major streams of privileged or marginalized identities are blended together with regard to various individuals or communities. For instance, one of the earliest manifestations of intersectionality, and this notably predates intersectionality talk by nearly a decade, is womanism. Womanism arose out of the context of the Black liberation philosophy and theology and feminist philosophy and theology of the 70s. Now, not surprisingly, given all that we have just said about the epistemological privilege of marginalized perspectives, Black women, while they fully supported the civil rights movements and Black liberation movements, while they fully supported these movements, they also noticed that there were significant aspects of their marginalization as women that remained invisible to the mainstream Black liberation movement, whose major leaders and theorists were all men, right? So that was the epistemological privilege of the women to notice dynamics that remained invisible to the men because of the privilege they had by being men, even though by virtue of being Black, they were marginalized in other ways. At the same time, these Black women noticed that there were significant aspects of their marginalization as Blacks that remained invisible to the feminist movement, whose major leaders, theorists were all, or at least largely all, white. So Alice Walker, famously saying that womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender, coined the term womanism to affirm the distinct identities of and challenges prejudice facing those who were both black and woman. The intersection of the categories addressed by black liberation theology and feminist theology, with the black theology tended to be not attended to the oppression of women, and the feminist theology tended not to be alert to the oppression of blacks. Womanists work at the intersection of these two. All right. So as these examples make clear, many of us may be privileged in some ways and marginalized in others. Intersectionality should name the attempt to be as clear, comprehensive, and precise as is possible about the various intersections of privilege and marginalization in our own and others' identities, and should lead us to want to remain open to new perspectives our privilege unwittingly obscures from view. This is one of the things about systemic distortions. If you're within a systemic distortion, and particularly if you're privileged by it, it's very difficult for you to see it. That's the reason for humility and openness, right? So with regard to both feminists and womanists of the 70s and 80s, for instance, consider that in the early 1990s, the male-female binary, presupposed by both womanists and feminists, was brought into question. And in the same spirit with which white feminists worked to acknowledge womanist critique and insights into feminism, both womanists and feminists were soon working to acknowledge the critique and insights of queer theorists, interrogating the essentialist sex binary, which permeated the early work of feminists and womanists. The gender binary was already acknowledged as a construction, right? So this is the way in which new forms of systemic distortion can be unveiled and then need to be integrated into one's overall understanding of identity and sensitivities. And so it goes, right? As critical theorists continue to work to unmask structural systemic distortions, which wound by illicitly privileging certain identities and delegitimizing others. And so it goes. As we keep working at this, it keeps going. So there's a need for continual openness. But this task and concern to pursue this work is what links critical theory to the Christian theology of Wesley and Gutierrez, for both are concerned to perform the love of neighbor by working on behalf of the marginalized. So I probably need to specify that intersectionality should not be used to absolutely privilege any one perspective. Where this does happen, and it does happen sometimes, one sees, unfortunately, a replication of familiar illicit attempts to privilege the perspective of one's own community. So it turns out such moves are not the unique prerogative of modern Western white men. Now, obviously, there is debate about what forms of marginalization are legitimate. Gutierrez and Pope Francis are Catholic, as are notably many of the most significant feminist theologians. And the Catholic Church does not, as an institution, affirm the equal status of men and women, and intentionally marginalizes those who are queer. Now, the Catholic Church is certainly not alone in these regards, and the positions of individual Catholics diverge significantly from the Church's official position. I'm just saying we need to... I don't want to be papering over the fact that there would be a lot of debate over some of the issues, some of the things that I have put forward as systemic distortions that are problematic. So while I am a Christian theologian who is progressive on these issues, we will not pursue here these important debates. Vis-a-vis this introductory consideration of Gutierrez, we will see what theological insights can be gained by following his focus upon poverty, along with his structural analyses. Let me note for the record that I heard Gutierrez once in person at a conference, and while he does not appear to take care in subtle ways, he does appear, rather, to take care in subtle ways to be inclusive of women in his work. In a public forum in the early 90s, he acknowledged that in retrospect, he considered his work in this regard, that is in regard to the concerns of feminism, he regarded his work to be inadequate. As we have seen, while Wesley was innocent of these later developments in modern hermeneutics, because they just hadn't been developed in his time, Insofar as the Wesleyan quadrilaterally accurately depicts the sources of authority in his thought, Wesley, in other words, he appeals to reason, tradition, experience, and scripture. All four, not privileging any one, but they're all engaged at the same time when he's doing theology. Insofar as he's doing this, Wesley is already largely operating on the far side of the appeals to objective universal understanding, which purportedly transcends the limits of one's facticity. In other words, these illicit appeals, it turns out, that are not valid, he's not wrapped up in them. So Schleiermacher, again, was the father of modern hermeneutical theory, which finally dethrones the modern Western epistemological project. Wesley, without really doing the analysis, is actually functioning already in this space. And Latin American liberationists, together with black feminist and womanist theologians, are among the earliest modern intellectuals explicitly to theorize from a post-epistemological perspective. Again, this is largely a result of what we were discussing a second ago in terms of the epistemological privilege of those who are themselves actually marginalized. They are sensitized to these issues and awaken to them more easily and more directly. All right, a couple of closing observations. First, one sometimes hears people object to one theology or another because it begins with experience, right? You can't begin with experience. That's all relative and subjective. So in the light of the now firmly established insights of modern hermeneutics, it should be clear that experience is an essential element of all knowledge. So the claim that one is a part of a theology which does not begin with experience is in fact a way of surreptitiously asserting that one's own experience is absolute, normative, universal, which is illicit. In fact, theologians for more than half a century have followed philosophers who themselves acknowledge their debt to Schleiermacher in recognizing the contingent character of all knowledge. All knowledge has an experiential dimension. Second, not only does one need to interrogate the illicit claims of epistemological superiority from those who claim they are doing theology without any dependence upon experience, we need to correct those who for some reason think theology itself has typically claimed not to begin in part from experience. This is a curious way, I find, and an accurate way of dismissing theology. As the figures we are considering should make clear, Wesley, Schleiermacher, we could do Tillich, really almost anyone, this contention only reveals that real theology should be dismissed because it doesn't include experience, or real theology never started with experience. All those sorts of claims make clear is that we're dealing with someone who has no real knowledge or understanding, not only of Wesley, Schleiermacher, and a multitude of modern Western theologians, including Reformation theologians like Calvin. They are also innocent of the apophatic and via negativa trajectories that permeate the entirety of the theological tradition. All right. Third, however, and in some ways a rejoinder to those who claim too much purity for what they gain from the via negativa or apophatic theology, it is important to note that the instant any experience begins to be understood in any way, tradition and reason are in play. For all human understanding is historically conditioned. This is why I so heartily approve of the Wesleyan quadrilateral, for it integrates experience, tradition, and reason, all of which are an integral interplay in all human reflection, in addition to Scripture, which itself is a product of experience, reason, and tradition, which is also together with Scripture, which is also Scripture, which is also together with experience, tradition, and reason, an intrinsic part of any specifically Christian theological perspective. So in this way, oddly, and to some degree accidentally, the Wesleyan quadrilateral is ahead of its time and is well positioned to deal with contemporary understandings of the character of knowledge. Okay, I'm simply going to stop here, leaving many questions unanswered. And of course, for those of you who are in my classes, many questions to be asked and discussed later. But hopefully this provides some, at least enough initial orientation to disarm superficial criticism of Gutierrez, and to prepare us for the study of black, feminist, womanist, mujerista theologies, and a touch of queer theory in future introductory lectures. So the next, after this, I'm going to conclude this, I'll turn to some major themes in Gutierrez's theology.